The laughter rippled through the reception hall like a careless wave. But when the punchline landed, it cut through Alina sharper than glass. Daniel stood at the microphone, face glowing with the intoxication of attention. Spinning a story that was more venom than humor, he turned her past something deeply personal, once shared in trust into a cheap joke, served to a crowd that had been softened by champagne and sentiment. The applause was loud, the laughter louder. Her knuckles whitened around her clutch, but her expression didn't so much as twitch. If Daniel wanted to make her a spectacle, he would regret it in ways he couldn't yet imagine. When the toast came, she lifted her glass high, the crystal catching the golden light like a weapon, disguised as celebration. Her lips curved politely, her gaze serene, but under the stillness her mind was already in motion. Each word she spoke was warm enough to pass as sincerity, but threaded through with the quiet steel of a promise. The guests clinked glasses, oblivious to the silent vow forming in the shadows of her thoughts, a vow Daniel would never hear until it was too late. The buzz of conversation grew again, but the rhythm had shifted. The laughter from earlier had begun to sour, replaced with the soft hum of side murmurs. Alina moved through the room like she belonged there, as if the joke had been nothing more than a triviality, yet her eyes missed nothing. A bridesmaid's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. An old friend glanced at her, then quickly away. Even the best actors couldn't mask the flicker of guilt, the faint wince of someone who had laughed when they shouldn't have. Daniel, of course, noticed none of it. He was too busy holding court, leaning against the bar with a confidence so bloated it bordered on arrogance. Each laugh he coaxed from his little audience fed his ego, blinding him to the fact that he was being watched. Alina studied him, the way a hawk studies its prey, measuring distance, waiting for the right wind. If he felt her eyes on him, he gave no sign. That suited her perfectly. The most dangerous predators are the ones their prey never sees coming. Every detail etched itself into her memory with surgical precision. Who clapped the hardest? Who looked down in shame? Who smirked as if they'd been waiting for her humiliation? She filed them away not as enemies or allies, but as pieces of a puzzle she intended to solve. Daniel thought tonight had been his victory. He didn't know it was only the opening move. The lights above shimmered like constellations, and in that artificial starlight, her mind began to weave threads together. There would be no public scenes, no angry confrontations. Revenge wasn't about speed, it was about patience. She would dismantle Daniel the same way he had tried to dismantle her, slowly, deliberately, and in front of an audience. The difference would be that when she was finished, no one would be laughing. While the band played and the dance floor filled, Alina slipped into the periphery. She became part of the background, a quiet figure moving between clusters of guests, collecting overheard fragments of conversation, noting subtle tells in posture and tone. She lingered near Daniel's circle, just long enough to catch the undercurrent of his dealings, hints of favors owed and secrets shared too freely. Each fragment was a thread, and she was patient enough to weave them into a snare. It came sooner than expected, a brief falter in Daniel's swagger, a name he shouldn't have mentioned. A debt he tried to joke away but couldn't quite hide from the narrowing eyes of a man at the bar. The shift was small, but Alina recognized it instantly. There was a crack in his armor now, a weakness that could be pried open, and she would be the one to do it. When she finally crossed paths with him again, the night was winding down. Her smile was flawless, her tone light, but her eyes locked with his just long enough to plant the seed. He laughed, thinking her gracious, in defeat, never realizing that what he'd seen was the opposite. That smile wasn't forgiveness, it was a warning, and if Daniel had truly been paying attention, he would have heard the unspoken truth it carried. Your downfall is already scheduled. Alina had trusted Sophie's instincts. When her cousin introduced Daniel one rainy afternoon over coffee, it felt harmless, friendly. Even Sophie's voice was bright with excitement, promising Alina she'd finally met someone worth knowing. Back then, Daniel's smile was all warmth and ease, his compliments effortless. He seemed interested in her work, asked thoughtful questions, and carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being liked. She didn't know that in shaking his hand, she'd just opened the first page of a slow-burning betrayal that would span years. It began small, a favor here, a confidence there. Daniel learned quickly that Elena's loyalty was a steady thing, dependable and discreet. She covered for him when meetings ran late, stepped in to smooth over the whispers of poor decisions, even defended him when others hinted at less than honorable dealings. Protecting him became habit, not because she owed him anything, but because she thought friendship deserved it. Each time she guarded a secret, Daniel learned he could push further, and she never noticed how much of herself she was spending to keep his slate clean. To the world, Daniel was flawless. He moved through rooms like he'd been designed for them impeccably, dressed, sharp-witted, quick to charm, but beneath that polish was something colder. He had a way of assessing people, not for who they were, but for how useful they might be. Alina saw flickers of it in quiet moments, the pause before he decided whether someone was worth a smile, the sharpness in his eyes when crossed. She filed those moments away but told herself they were harmless. After all, Sophie seemed happy. That had to mean something. At Sophie's engagement party, Alina watched her cousin glow, every gesture towards Daniel tender, unthinking. The man played his role perfectly, attentive and gallant. He kissed Sophie's hand like they were in some old movie, made promises in the kind of voice people wanted to believe, and Sophie did. She believed so completely that Alina swallowed, her unease rather than taint the day. She told herself it was love, and love made people different, but the cracks deepened. Daniel began to lace their conversations with small barbs disguised as humor. He'd forget debts, brush off responsibilities she had shouldered on his behalf, and turn her into the punchline in rooms where she had once commanded respect. The more she tried to ignore it, the more frequent it became, each slight sharper than the last. What had once been subtle now had teeth. The final shift came quietly, tucked between a handshake and a smile. Alina learned through a document, left open on a shared desk, that Daniel had used privileged information she'd shared in confidence to block her from a promotion. He hadn't even done it for gain, just to prove he could. The realization slid through her like ice. All those years of trust had been ammunition for him. When he stood at Sophie's wedding reception, microphone in hand, and turned her past into a public joke, it clicked into place. This wasn't clumsiness or a momentary lapse, it was the crescendo of something long and deliberate. He had orchestrated it, step by step, to remind her of her place. The laughter of the crowd blurred into a dull hum. Alina didn't flinch, didn't let her expression break. If Daniel wanted her humiliation, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of reaction. Instead, she lifted her glass with steady hands, met his gaze, and let the silence between them harden into something unspoken but unbreakable. There would be no shouting match, no scene to feed his ego. Only the quiet, calculated beginning of a countdown he didn't know had started, one that would end with him wondering when exactly he lost control. Daniel thought his charm was unshakable, but Alina had learned how to watch people without them noticing. She studied the way he interrupted others mid-sentence, the way he inflated his own role in every success, the way his gaze sharpened when a conversation shifted toward competition. His ego wasn't just large, it was careless. He reached for recognition like a starving man at a feast, never questioning who might be watching. She noticed his patterns, the weaknesses disguised as confidence, and quietly stored them away. Looking back, she saw how many signs she had ignored. There had been the time he mocked a client for being too sentimental moments after taking their money. The shortcuts he took in deals, always skirting the line between clever and corrupt. The callous jokes he made at Sophie's expense, masked as teasing. Alina had excused it all under the banner of stress or just his way. But those red flags, once scattered and harmless-looking, had now formed a clear pattern, one that told her exactly what kind of man Daniel was. She began placing herself near the people who saw everything but were rarely hurt: the florists, the caterers, the photographer's assistant. These vendors spoke freely when they thought no one important was listening. A casual question here, a sympathetic nod there, and soon Alina had threads of truth. Whispered complaints about unpaid bills, stories of Daniel snapping over trivial delays, careless confessions made after too many drinks. The picture was taking shape, and it was darker than she had imagined. The confirmation came during what Daniel must have thought was a private moment. She lingered behind the drape near the staff corridor, unseen, as he laughed with one of his groomsmen about putting her in her place at the reception. He spoke about her humiliation as if it were a game he'd won, as though her silence had been surrender. She stood there, heartbeat steady, letting every word settle into her memory. His arrogance was doing half her work for her. If Daniel thought he was untouchable, Alina knew better. She reached out to people from her past, an old colleague who still had access to company records, a journalist friend who owed her a favor, and someone much closer to Daniel than he'd ever suspect. Together, they became the quiet architecture of her plan, a network invisible to him but sharp enough to cut. Her days developed a new rhythm. Early mornings meant secure calls with allies, Afternoons were spent sifting through encrypted documents, piecing together timelines, finding inconsistencies he would never expect her to know. At night, she refined the narrative, ensuring that when it broke, every piece of evidence would align so perfectly that no one could doubt it. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her tools were silence, patience, and precision. In her notebook, she wrote 3 names in careful, looping ink: Daniel's, of course, but also the 2 people who had stood beside him in every deception. Each had played their part in keeping her in the shadows, and each would face the consequences when the time came. She knew it wasn't yet. His crown still gleamed under the lights, but she could see the fault lines running through it. It wasn't fixed, it was balanced, precarious, and waiting for the right push. And when she gave it, it wouldn't just slip, it would fall, shattering so completely that no one would ever try to piece it back together. Daniel's downfall began with his own hands on the keyboard. The email was long, laced with smug self-congratulation and a cruel dissection of those he believed too weak or too stupid to notice how he'd used them. He named names, detailed the moves he thought would never be traced back to him, and signed it with the kind of flourish only a man convinced of his invincibility would dare. He didn't realize he'd just written his confession. It was a small, almost laughable error-on email meant for one of his co-conspirators, went instead to someone else entirely. That someone was no accident of fate. Alina had placed them there, months earlier, a silent piece on her board. They didn't question what to do. The message was forwarded without commentary, the digital equivalent of placing a loaded weapon in her hand. The content was worse than she'd hoped for and better than she'd dreamed. Paragraph after paragraph confirmed not only the depth of his personal malice toward her, but also his role in a web of insider trades so blatant it seemed almost a parody of corporate crime. Dates, amounts, even the names of companies, they were all there in black and white. She didn't rush. This wasn't a trophy to wave around. This was a key, and she intended to use it to open the largest door possible. Daniel, meanwhile, was consumed with preparations for the gala that would cement his legacy. It was to be the night the industry hailed him as a visionary. The guest list glittered with investors, board members, and media figures. Every toast, every handshake, every staged photograph was meant to project success so undeniable it would silence any hint of dissent. He had no idea he'd be stepping into the brightest spotlight of his life and that Alina had already decided what he would say under it. Invitations became her quiet weapon. Through subtle favors and whispered suggestions, she ensured that certain people who had never before attended would be their regulators. Journalists, executives with rival interests. The crowd would be polite, attentive, and ready for a story they didn't yet know they were part of. Every eye would be where she needed it to be when the curtain lifted. Her attention to detail was meticulous. The seating plan ensured that the most influential witnesses would be close enough to see his face clearly. The order of speeches placed him just after a moment designed to lock every guest's attention forward. Even the lighting was adjusted to make the stage seem warmer, more intimate, perfect for revealing truths that would cut deeper than any accusation shouted in anger. Daniel had dreamed of this night for years, imagining himself immortalized in the industry's memory. Alina decided to grant his wish. His name would indeed be remembered, his story told and retold in Lynott as the tale of triumph he had envisioned. She would give him his legend, crafted with the precision of a master storyteller and the inevitability of justice long delayed. When the night was over, no one would remember the man he pretended to be. They would remember the man she revealed. Alina entered the ballroom as if she owned the air itself. Every step was deliberate, her expression serene, her poise unshakable. The gown, the diamonds, the calm smile, they were all part of the theater. No one saw the true weapon she carried, not even Daniel, whose laughter floated across the room. With the arrogance of a man, certain his crown could never slip, the dagger she held tonight was not steel, it was truth sharpened to a lethal point. Tucked inside her clutch, hidden beneath a silk handkerchief, was a small black USB drive. On it lived the collapse of Daniel's empire, signed contracts doctored in his favor, recorded calls where he boasted of fixing deals, and the email that showed him mocking the very board members now clapping him on the back. It was compact enough to fit in her palm, but heavy enough to sink him forever. She had protected it like a relic. Because that's what it was, the artifact that would rewrite history. She approached the PR manager with the elegance of someone making casual conversation. "Something you'll want before the night's over," she murmured, slipping the drive into his hand, disguised inside a velvet box. "Exclusive story. Embargoed until you hear from me." His curiosity was immediate, his smile polite but knowing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. In this world, the most valuable currency was the one you didn't announce. Timing was everything. She waited through the toasts, through the polite applause, until Daniel rose to deliver his grand speech. His voice carried with rehearsed confidence, his cadence slow enough to invite admiration. She tilted her head slightly toward the PR manager. That was the signal. Seconds later, the files began to flow, mails, recordings, financial ledgers spreading like wildfire through inboxes, newsrooms, and private investor threads. By the time Daniel reached the halfway mark of his opening remarks, the storm was already gathering beyond the edge of the stage lights. It started small. An investor glanced at his phone and frowned. A journalist excused herself, mid-laugh. Then came the ripples, whispers swelling into a hum, smiles collapsing into thin, tight lines. Conversations broke away from him like water retreating from a sinking ship. The change in the room's temperature was almost tangible, a sudden drop that no lighting could disguise. Daniel stumbled over a sentence, his rhythm shattering. His eyes darted across the audience, searching for the admiration that had filled it minutes before, only to find suspicion sharpening into something colder. He didn't yet know exactly what had happened, but he could feel the power bleeding from the room, dripping away faster than he could gather it. Across the hall, Alina caught his gaze. She lifted her champagne glass in a silent toast, her expression, unreadable yet absolute in its meaning. No words were necessary. The truth was speaking loudly enough. In that moment, the king knew his reign was over. And the queen, who had stood quietly in his shadow, was now the one writing the end of his story. It took less than 2 days for the first cracks to widen into chasms. Regulatory investigators descended with subpoenas. Investors withdrew funding with statements that barely concealed their disgust. And partners Daniel once bragged about having in his pocket scrambled to erase all traces of association. The man who had spent years crafting an image of untouchable power found himself cornered by forces he couldn't charm, threaten, or by. Every headline was sharper than the last, slicing away the last threads of his credibility. By the third morning, Sophie's name appeared in the public court docket. She hadn't hesitated. The evidence she now possessed, emails, financial trails, even recorded conversations, painted a picture too poisonous to salvage. Her petition for annulment was brutal in its precision, naming fraud, emotional manipulation, and betrayal as grounds. For Daniel, it was not just the end of a marriage. It was the final signal to the world that those closest to him had abandoned ship. Then came the video. A simple clip from their wedding reception, once private, now viral, across every major platform. In it, Daniel gave a smug toast, laced with jokes about winning in business and in love, while Alina, seated just a few feet away, smiled with perfect composure. Paired with the recent revelations, the footage was no longer romantic, was damning. The public painted Daniel as the villain without hesitation, while Alina became a quiet symbol of dignity under fire. Her expression dissected frame by frame like a masterclass in restraint. As the chaos consumed him, Elena's world moved in the opposite directions, steady, deliberate, and upward. At a rival firm, the position Daniel had once blocked her from obtaining was suddenly offered without hesitation. It was no accident. The allies she had cultivated in silence stepped forward at just the right moment, vouching for her skill and integrity. She accepted the role without fanfare, knowing her rise would sting him more precisely because it was earned, not taken. And then seconds. No interviews, no public statements, no celebratory posts. Elena's refusal to add her voice to the chorus of Daniel's critics made her absence deafening. In a world addicted to noise, her restraint was sharper than any insult. Every unanswered call, every declined request for comment, reminded him that he no longer had the power to force her attention. When the crown finally fell, it was almost anticlimactic. One last press release announced the dissolution of his company. No one celebrated openly. No one needed to pit. The silence that followed was the truest measure of his defeat. Somewhere, Daniel surely imagined her reaction. But Alina gave him nothing, no words, no glance. Not even the satisfaction of knowing he was still a thought in her mind. She had won without ever needing to say she had. And that, she knew, was the kind of victory that never fades.